Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlit Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. The house sat close enough to the shoreline that the sound of water never really left. Even when the tide pulled back, something in the distance continued to move, like the sea didn't fully withdraw from this place. The rain had started not long after I moved in, settling into a steady pattern that felt less like weather and more like a condition the house existed under. The first time Ellis reacted, I thought it was nothing. He was looking at a corner that didn't seem to exist the same way twice. From the living room, the windows faced outward toward a stretch of dark, wet ground that reflected just enough light to blur the boundary between inside and outside. At night, the glass didn't feel like a surface. It felt like a thin layer between two spaces that didn't fully agree with each other. I hadn't unpacked much. A few boxes sat along the wall, still sealed, as if opening them would make things more permanent than I was ready for. The house didn't feel wrong, just unfamiliar in a way that made it difficult to decide what counted as normal. Ellis moved through it differently. He had chosen his places within the first hour, near the window, by the corner where the wall met the glass, sometimes just beside the reflection of the room rather than the room itself. I noticed that before I realized why it felt unusual. The first time he made a sound, it was quiet enough that I almost missed it. A low, steady vibration in his chest as he lay facing the window, not directed outside, not fully inside either. His head was angled slightly, like he was aligning himself with something I couldn't see. I didn't get up immediately. I watched him from the couch, trying to follow his attention without making it obvious I was doing it. The corner near the window held my focus longer than it should have. There was nothing there, just a clean intersection of wall and frame. But the space seemed to carry a kind of depth that didn't match the rest of the room, not visually, more in the way my eyes settled into it and didn't move on right away. Ellis stopped the sound on his own, not abruptly. It faded, like he had decided it was no longer necessary. He didn't look at me. He stayed where he was, eyes fixed, body still. There was no tension in him, which made it harder to treat as a warning. It didn't feel like he was reacting to something happening. It felt like he had noticed something that already existed. I stood up slowly and walked toward him. The floor creaked once under my weight, and for a moment, his ears shifted not toward the sound, but slightly ahead of it, as if he had expected it before it happened. I paused. The room felt the same. Nothing moved. The rain outside continued in a steady rhythm, hitting the ground in a way that blurred the reflection in the glass. I stepped closer to the window. My reflection appeared faintly, layered over the dark outside. Behind it, the room stretched back the way it should, but the corner just to the right held a little longer than the rest. I blinked, and the feeling passed. For a second, it felt like I had seen something shift, but when I tried to focus on it, there was nothing to confirm. Ellis shifted his position slightly, not away, just adjusting, as if the angle he had been using wasn't quite right anymore. I placed my hand lightly on his back. His body was warm, steady, no shaking, no stiffness, just a quiet kind of focus that didn't match anything I could see. "What is it?" I asked, more to hear my own voice than to get a response. He didn't react, not ignoring me, just not needing to respond. I followed his line of sight again, this time trying to look not at the corner itself, but around it. The reflection in the glass showed the room behind me. Everything looked consistent, but the space between the couch and the wall inside the reflection felt slightly extended. Not enough to measure, just enough that it held my attention longer than expected. I turned around to check. The distance looked normal. When I looked back at the window, the reflection had settled again. It left a brief impression that something had been there a moment ago. Not visible, just recently gone. Ellis exhaled quietly. Not relief, just a small release, like something had completed a step. I stepped back from the glass. The room felt easier to look at from a distance. I told myself it was nothing. It could have been the glass. Old panes sometimes bend reflections slightly, or the angle of the light. Even the rain itself, layering movement over still surfaces. There were enough explanations to choose from. None of them stayed long enough to feel complete. New place, different light, rain affecting reflections. It made sense that things would feel slightly off until I adjusted. Ellis eventually lay down, resting his head on his paws again. But he didn't stop watching. Not the way dogs usually do, drifting in and out of attention. He stayed with it, consistently, as if whatever he was looking at didn't move, or didn't need to. The rain continued without change. The sound didn't shift, not even slightly. At some point, I turned off the main light and left only the lamp on. The reflection shifted again, softer this time, less defined. The corner near the window didn't stand out as much, but the space felt aligned in a way I couldn't explain. I sat back down on the couch and tried not to look directly at it. That lasted a few minutes. Then my eyes went back without me deciding to move them. Ellis hadn't changed position, but his eyes had shifted slightly, not tracking movement, adjusting ahead of it. That was the first moment I noticed the pattern. He wasn't reacting to something appearing. He was positioning himself before it did. I didn't understand what that meant, so I let it go. The rain kept falling, steady and even, as if it had no reason to stop. The rain returned the next night at the same hour. It didn't build into it. There was no gradual shift in the air, no warning in the sky. It simply began, as if something had resumed rather than started. The sound matched the night before so closely that it felt less like weather and more like repetition. I noticed it before Ellis did, or maybe I only thought I did. He was already standing near the window when I looked over, his body angled the same way as before, not directly facing outside, slightly offset, as if the direction he cared about wasn't aligned with the world beyond the glass. I stayed where I was, watching him instead of the window. There was something different in the way he held himself. Not tense, not alert, measured. His head moved slowly, barely enough to register as movement at first. A small shift to the right, then stillness. A few seconds later, another adjustment. This time, slightly upward. Nothing in the room moved. Nothing in the reflection changed. But Ellis kept adjusting. Each movement small, precise, as if he were tracking something that followed a path too subtle for me to see. I stood up. The floor gave a quiet sound under my step, and again, his ears shifted before the sound fully settled into the room. That detail stayed with me. Something about it made my breathing feel slightly uneven. It didn't feel like coincidence. I moved closer to him, stopping a few feet behind where he stood. From this angle, the reflection in the window caught more of the room. The couch, the lamp, the unopened boxes. Everything appeared where it should, but the spacing felt inconsistent. Not wrong enough to notice at a glance, just enough that when my eyes moved from one object to another, the distance between them didn't feel fixed, like it adjusted depending on how I looked at it. I focused on the corner near the window again. It didn't feel deeper this time. It felt slightly shifted, as if the angle of the space itself had changed without moving the walls. Ellis made a small sound. Not a growl, something quieter, almost like a low breath pushed out slowly, without urgency. He stepped a few inches to the left, then stopped. That was new. Before, he had stayed in one place. Now he was repositioning, not reacting, correcting. I followed his movement with my eyes. From where he stood now, his line of sight passed through the reflection at a different angle. I tried to match it. I leaned slightly to the side, adjusting my own position to see what he might be seeing. For a moment, the reflection seemed to stretch, not visibly, not in a way I could point to, but the space behind me, the reflected space, felt longer than the actual room. I straightened up quickly. The feeling collapsed back into something normal. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath. Ellis didn't move. He remained in that new position, holding his gaze steady, waiting. That was when I understood something else. He wasn't just tracking. He was anticipating. His movements came before any change I could perceive. And when I did notice something, however small, it always aligned with where he had already adjusted. I stepped back. The distance between me and the window felt slightly different than before. Not closer, not farther, just uncertain. I turned away and walked toward the kitchen. The moment I left the living room, the feeling eased. Not completely, but enough that it didn't hold my attention the same way. I stood at the counter for a while, listening to the rain. It hadn't changed. Not in rhythm, not in intensity. The same steady pattern, repeating without variation. After a few minutes, I looked back toward the living room. Ellis had moved again. He was no longer near the window. He stood closer to the center of the room now, facing slightly toward the hallway. His body was angled differently, not aligned with the glass anymore, aligned with something inside the house. I walked back slowly. "Ellis," I said, not raising my voice. He didn't look at me. His gaze shifted slightly to the right, then stopped. I followed it. The hallway looked normal. The walls, the floor, the closed door at the end. Nothing out of place. But the space, just inside the hallway entrance, felt extended. The same way the corner near the window had felt before. Not visibly, just in the way it held my attention. Ellis took a small step back, then another, not retreating in fear, adjusting distance, creating space. That movement stayed with me longer than anything else. It didn't feel like he was avoiding something. It felt like he was making room for it. A quiet unease settled in, not sharp, not immediate, just enough to make me aware of how still everything had become. Even the rain, though unchanged, seemed to sit behind the moment instead of filling it. I shifted my weight, considering whether to step into the hallway. Before I could decide, Ellis moved again. He turned away from it. Not abruptly, just a smooth change in direction, as if the position he had been holding was no longer necessary. He walked toward the bedroom, slow, even steps. No hesitation. I watched him go, waiting for him to look back. He didn't. When he reached the doorway, he paused briefly, not to check behind him, just pausing. Then he continued inside. I stood alone in the living room. The space felt normal again. The hallway no longer held that extended feeling. The corner near the window didn't pull at my focus. Everything looked as it should. That made it harder to trust. I walked to the window once more. The reflection showed me standing there. Behind me, the room appeared consistent, but something about the way the space held itself felt settled, not stable, final, as if it had reached a configuration it preferred. I stayed there for a moment, watching my reflection, trying to find something out of place. There was nothing I could point to, and that was what stayed with me. Not that something had changed, that it no longer needed to. The rain continued, steady and exact, as if it had already decided how long it would last. The third night didn't feel like it began. The rain returned the same way, without build-up, without variation. By then, I had started to expect it, though I couldn't explain why. It came at the same hour, carried the same rhythm, and settled over the house like something resuming a position it had never fully left. I didn't turn on the main light this time, only the lamp. The room stayed dim enough that the windows reflected more than they revealed. The glass held a softened version of everything behind me, layered faintly over the dark outside. Ellis wasn't in the living room when the rain started. I noticed that immediately. Not because I was looking for him, but because the absence felt placed. Like something had shifted in the structure of the room simply by him not being there. I stood near the couch for a moment, listening. The house was quiet beyond the rain. No movement from the hallway. No sound from the bedroom. I walked slowly toward the doorway, not calling his name. The hallway looked the same as before, but the space inside it felt more defined now. Not extended, not distorted, just set, as if it had chosen a shape and held it. Ellis sat near the bedroom door, facing outward, not toward me, toward the living room. His posture was different again, lower, more settled. There was no tension in him at all, no readiness to move. He wasn't tracking. He wasn't anticipating. He was already where he needed to be. I stopped a few steps away from him. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his eyes shifted slightly. Not toward me, past me. I didn't turn right away. The feeling came first. A small, quiet pressure in the space behind me. Not physical, just a sense that the room had adjusted itself again. I turned slowly. The living room looked unchanged. The window reflected the same dim image of the space, but the arrangement of distance felt complete, not stretching, not shifting, just fixed, as if whatever had been moving through it had finished aligning. I walked back into the living room. Ellis didn't follow. He stayed in the hallway, watching, or maybe not watching anymore, just present. I stopped a few feet from the window. The reflection showed me standing there, the lamp behind me casting a soft glow across the room. For a moment, everything held steady. Then I noticed something small. The reflection of the couch, just at the edge, seemed slightly farther from me than it should be. I turned halfway to check. The real couch was where it had always been. When I looked back, the reflection hadn't changed, but the feeling remained. Not wrong, just offset. I stepped closer to the glass. I didn't move any further for a moment, though I wasn't sure why. My reflection moved with me. The space behind it didn't resist. It accepted the movement too easily, like it had already accounted for it. That was when Ellis moved. I heard it behind me, not the sound itself, the intention of it. He walked into the living room and came to my side. Slow, even, no hesitation. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him against my leg. For the first time, he didn't look past me. He didn't look at the room. He didn't adjust. He simply remained still. I followed his line of sight again. Not outside. Not directly at the reflection. Slightly above it, where the glass held both the room and the darkness beyond. I let my focus settle there. The space didn't stretch. It's hard to explain exactly what felt different about it. It didn't distort. It didn't shift. It just revealed itself in a way I hadn't allowed before. Not as a shape, not as a figure, but as something defined by how the space around it behaved. A quiet interruption in the way distance should work. Closer than it had ever seemed. Not approaching, already present. Ellis leaned gently against my leg, not seeking comfort, just aligning. There was no fear in him, no warning. Nothing that suggested danger, only recognition. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel threatened. I felt included. And the only thing that had changed was my ability to notice. The reflection in the window held all of it together. Me, Ellis, the room behind us, and that quiet disruption in the space that didn't need to move to exist. For a moment, I considered looking away, but there was nowhere else for my focus to go. Everything in the room felt connected to that point now. Not pulled toward it, just part of the same arrangement. The rain continued, unchanged, steady, exact, as if it had always been falling this way. Ellis exhaled softly and rested more of his weight against me. Still calm, still certain. I understood then why he had stopped reacting, why the growling had faded, why the tracking had ended. There was nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to warn against. Because whatever he had been following, whatever had been aligning itself through the space of the house, had reached a point where it no longer needed to remain separate from it. And I had reached the point where I could finally see it. Not directly, but enough. Enough to understand that it had always been here. Not passing through, not entering, just present in a way I hadn't been able to recognize before. The room didn't feel different anymore. It felt complete. The rain continued through the night, steady and unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. The house sat close enough to the shoreline that the sound of water never really left. Even when the tide pulled back, something distant continued to move, as if the sea didn't fully separate from this place. The rain had started not long after I arrived, settling into a steady pattern that felt less like weather and more like a condition the house existed under. From the living room, the windows faced a stretch of dark, wet ground that held a faint reflection of the house. At night, the glass didn't behave like a surface. It felt thin, as if it was holding two versions of the same space that didn't completely agree. I hadn't unpacked much. Boxes remained sealed along the wall, their edges still sharp, their weight still unfamiliar. The house didn't feel wrong. I wasn't used to how quiet this place was yet. It felt like the kind of quiet that expected something, just unfinished in a way that made it hard to tell what belonged and what didn't. He had told himself the move was practical, a smaller place, quieter surroundings, fewer distractions. But the truth sat somewhere underneath that explanation. The last place had been louder than it needed to be, arguments that stayed longer than they should, silences that didn't resolve. Leaving had felt less like a decision and more like stepping out of something he didn't know how to fix. Ellis didn't seem to struggle with that. He moved through the rooms as if the layout had already settled into him. The first place he chose was near the window, close to the corner where the wall met the glass. Not facing outward, not fully inward either. Slightly angled, as if the direction that mattered wasn't aligned with either. The first sound he made almost slipped past me, a low vibration, held quietly in his chest. Not directed at anything I could identify. His head tilted just enough to suggest he was aligning himself with something that didn't match the visible space. I stayed on the couch, watching him without moving. The corner near the window held my attention longer than it should have. There was nothing there. Just a clean meeting of surfaces. Still, the space carried a kind of depth that didn't match the rest of the room. Not visible, just felt. Ellis let the sound fade out on its own. Not cut off. Released. He didn't look at me. He didn't shift position. He simply remained there, eyes steady, as if what he had noticed hadn't changed. That made it harder to ignore. I stood and walked toward him. The floor gave a small sound under my step, and before it settled, his ears moved slightly just ahead of it. The timing was subtle, but clear enough that I paused without meaning to. The room held still around us. Rain continued against the ground outside, softening the reflection in the glass. I stepped closer to the window. My reflection appeared faintly, layered over the darkness beyond. Behind it, the room stretched back in a way that should have felt familiar. But the corner just to the right held differently. It didn't deepen. It didn't shift. It simply stayed with me longer than the rest of the space. I blinked, and the feeling loosened. Ellis adjusted his position. Not away. Just slightly, like the angle he had been using no longer matched. I rested my hand on his back. Warm. Steady. No tension. That absence of urgency unsettled me more than anything else. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He didn't respond. Not ignoring me. Just not needing to. I followed his line of sight again, this time letting my focus drift rather than locking onto anything specific. The reflection showed the room behind me. Everything appeared consistent. But the spacing between objects just within the reflection felt less certain. The distance between the couch and the wall seemed to stretch slightly, not in shape, but in how it held my attention. I turned to check. The real space remained unchanged. When I looked back, the reflection had settled again. Ellis exhaled softly. Not relief, something quieter, like a small adjustment had completed. I stepped back. Distance made the room easier to process. I told myself it was nothing. At least, that's what I went with. New place, different light, rain interfering with reflections. It made sense that perception would take time to settle. Ellis lay down again, resting his head on his paws. But he didn't drift. He stayed with it, consistently, as if whatever he was focused on didn't move, or didn't need to. The rain continued without variation. At some point, I turned off the main light and left only the lamp on. The reflection softened, edges blurred. The corner near the window didn't stand out as sharply, but the space felt arranged, not differently, just decided. I sat back on the couch and tried not to look. That lasted a few minutes. Then my eyes returned on their own. Ellis hadn't changed position, but his gaze had shifted, not following movement, adjusting ahead of it. That was when the pattern became clear. He wasn't reacting to something appearing. He was positioning himself before it did. I didn't understand what that meant, so I let it stay unanswered. The rain continued, steady and exact, as if it had no intention of stopping. The rain returned the next night at the same hour. There was no lead into it, no shift in the air, no gradual build. It began in the exact way I remembered, as if the sound had been paused and then allowed to continue. For a moment, it was difficult to tell whether it had ever actually stopped. Ellis was already near the window when I looked over, not moving toward it, already there. His body held that same slight angle again, not fully aligned with the outside or the room behind him. It felt intentional, though I couldn't explain what he was aligning with. I stayed where I was, watching him instead of the glass. Something in the way he held himself had changed. Not tighter, not more alert, more precise. His head shifted slightly to the right, then stopped. A few seconds passed before it moved again, just a small adjustment upward. Each motion felt measured, like he was following a path that existed before he moved along it. Nothing in the room changed. Nothing in the reflection moved. But Ellis continued adjusting, slowly, carefully, as if he was keeping something centered. I stood up. The floor gave a quiet sound beneath me, and again, before it settled, his ears shifted just ahead of it. Not toward the sound itself, but toward where it would be. That detail lingered. He stayed where he was longer than he needed to, not because he wanted to understand it, but because leaving the room felt incomplete. Like stepping away would mean ignoring something that had already begun to involve him. It didn't feel random. I walked closer, stopping a few feet behind him. From there, the reflection showed more of the room, the couch, the lamp, the boxes along the wall. Everything appeared in place, but the spacing felt less certain, not incorrect, just unfixed. As my eyes moved between objects, the distance between them seemed to adjust slightly, as if it depended on how long I looked. I focused on the corner near the window. This time, it didn't feel deeper. It felt slightly misaligned, like the angle of the space had shifted without moving anything physical. Ellis made a small sound, not a growl, not even a warning, just a quiet release of breath. Held low, he stepped a few inches to the left, then stopped. That change stayed with me. Before, he had held position. Now he was repositioning, not reacting, correcting. I shifted my own stance to match his new angle, leaning slightly to see what he might be seeing. For a moment, the reflection seemed to stretch. Not visibly, but the space behind me, the reflected version of it, felt longer than the room itself. I straightened immediately. The sensation faded. Ellis remained still, holding that new position as if it had been the correct one all along. That was when the pattern became harder to ignore. He wasn't following something moving. He was aligning with something that behaved consistently. And whatever it was, it adjusted before I could notice it. I stepped back. The distance between me and the window felt uncertain again. Not closer, not farther, just not fixed. I turned and walked into the kitchen. The moment I left the living room, the pressure eased. Not completely, but enough that my thoughts felt clearer. I rested my hands against the counter and listened. There had been a call earlier that day, a brief one. The previous owner, checking if everything had settled in properly. He had asked about the house in a careful way, not directly, mostly about the weather, the view, whether the place felt quiet enough. At the time, It had seemed like small talk. Now, the phrasing felt slightly misplaced. "I assume the rain's not too much," the man had said. "It's steady," I had answered. A pause followed. Then, "It usually is." The rain hadn't changed. Not even a small variation. Not in rhythm. Not in intensity. It carried the same pattern, as if it had been measured and then repeated. After a while, I looked back toward the living room. Ellis had moved. He stood closer to the center now, no longer near the window. His body angled toward the hallway. Not outward. Not toward the glass. Inside. I walked back slowly. "Ellis," I said quietly. He didn't respond. His gaze shifted slightly to the right, then held. I followed it. The hallway looked unchanged. Flat walls. Closed door. No movement. But the space just inside the entrance felt extended. Not stretched. Not distorted. Just deeper, in a way that didn't match the rest of the house. Ellis took a small step back, then another, not retreating, adjusting distance, creating space. That movement felt deliberate, not avoidance, allowance. A quiet unease settled in, not sharp, not immediate, just enough to make me aware of how still everything had become. Even the rain, though unchanged, seemed to sit behind the moment rather than fill it. I shifted my weight, considering whether to step into the hallway. Before I could decide, Ellis moved again. He turned away from it, smooth, unhurried, as if the position he had been holding was no longer necessary. He walked toward the bedroom, even steps, no hesitation. I watched him go, waiting for him to look back. He didn't. At the doorway, he paused briefly, not checking behind him, just pausing. Then he continued inside. I remained where I was. The living room felt normal again. The hallway no longer held that extended feeling. The corner near the window no longer drew my attention. Everything appeared settled. That made it harder to trust. I walked back to the window. The reflection showed me standing there. Behind me, the room appeared consistent, but something in the way the space held itself felt finalized, not stable, set, as if it had reached a form it no longer needed to adjust from. I stood there for a moment, trying to find something specific that was wrong. There was nothing I could point to, and that absence of detail stayed with me longer than anything else. Not that something had changed, that it no longer needed to. The rain continued, steady and exact, as if it had already decided how long it would last. The third night didn't feel like it started. The rain returned the same way, without buildup, without change. By then, I had begun to expect it, though I couldn't explain why. It arrived at the same hour, carried the same rhythm, and settled over the house like something continuing rather than beginning. I left the main light off. Only the lamp remained. The room stayed dim enough that the windows held more of the inside than the outside. The glass reflected a softened version of the room, layered faintly over the darkness beyond. Ellis wasn't in the living room. I noticed that immediately, not because I was looking for him, but because the space felt arranged around his absence, like a piece had been removed from something that still held its shape. I stood near the couch, listening. No movement from the hallway, no sound from the bedroom. The house felt complete in a way that made it harder to trust. I walked slowly toward the hallway, not calling his name. The space inside it didn't feel stretched anymore. It felt defined, not correcting itself, finished. Ellis sat near the bedroom door, facing outward, not toward me, toward the living room. His posture had changed again, lower, settled. There was no tension left in him, no readiness, no anticipation. He wasn't tracking anymore. He had already reached whatever point the others had been leading to. I stopped a few steps away. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his eyes shifted slightly, not toward me, past me. I didn't turn right away. The change came first, a quiet adjustment in the space behind me. Not a movement, not a sound, just a shift in how the room held itself. I turned slowly. The living room looked the same. The window reflected the dim outline of the space. But the distances felt complete, not stretching, not uncertain, fixed, as if whatever had been aligning through the room had finished. I walked back into the living room. Ellis didn't follow. He remained where he was, not watching, not reacting, just present. I stopped a few feet from the window. The reflection showed me standing there, the lamp casting a soft shape behind me. For a moment, everything held. Then I noticed something small. The reflection of the couch just at the edge felt slightly farther away than it should be. I turned halfway to check. The real couch remained where it was. When I looked back, the reflection hadn't changed, but the feeling stayed. Not wrong, just offset. I stepped closer to the glass. My reflection moved with me. The space behind it didn't resist. It accepted the movement too easily, like it had already accounted for it. That was when Ellis moved. I didn't hear the step clearly. I felt the change in the room first. He walked into the living room and came to my side. Slow, even, certain. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him against my leg. For the first time, he didn't look past me. He didn't adjust. He didn't track. He simply remained still. I followed his gaze. Not outside. Not directly at the reflection. Slightly above it, where the glass held both the room and the dark beyond. I let my focus settle there. The space didn't stretch. It didn't shift. It didn't correct itself. It just revealed, not as a shape, not as something separate, but as a presence defined by how the space around it behaved. A quiet interruption in distance, closer than it had ever seemed. Not approaching, already there. Ellis leaned gently against my leg. "It's nothing," I said quietly, though the words didn't settle the way they should have. Ellis didn't react. He didn't need to. Not for comfort. Alignment. There was no fear in him. No warning. Only recognition. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel threatened. I felt included. For a moment, something close to hesitation surfaced. Not fear. Not even discomfort. Just a brief resistance to accepting what didn't fit into anything familiar. It passed quickly, not because it resolved, but because there didn't seem to be a reason to hold on to it, as if whatever existed in that space had never been separate from it. And the only thing that had changed was my ability to notice. The reflection held everything together. Me, Ellis, the room behind us, and that quiet disruption that didn't need to move to exist. For a moment, I thought about looking away, but there was nowhere else for my focus to go. Everything in the room felt connected to that point now, not pulled toward it, just arranged with it. The rain continued, unchanged, steady, exact, as if it had always been falling this way. Ellis exhaled softly and rested more of his weight against me. Still calm, still certain. That was when it settled. Why the growling had stopped. Why the tracking had ended. Why he no longer needed to adjust. There was nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to warn against. Because whatever had been moving through the space, whatever had been aligning itself night after night, had reached a point where it no longer needed to remain separate. And I had reached the point where I could finally see it. Not directly, but enough. Enough to understand that it had always been here. Not passing through, not entering, just present in a way I hadn't been able to recognize before. It wasn't that something had entered the space. It was that the space itself had always contained more than it showed. The difference was no longer in what existed, but in what I allowed myself to recognize. It hadn't been waiting to appear. It had been waiting for me to notice. The rain continued through the night, steady and unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. I'm still not sure if I understood it, or if I just stopped questioning it. Story number 2. Did you hear that again? The sound didn't come from the walls this time. It came from somewhere lower, somewhere that didn't belong to the house at all, like it had been there long before they moved in. There had been a sound earlier, not loud, not sharp, just something that didn't quite belong to the house. "It's the pipes," he said after a moment, though he hadn't heard water running all evening. The rain outside had settled into a slow, steady pattern, tapping against the windows in a way that felt distant, almost polite. The house had its own rhythm, separate from the storm. Elric had chosen the house because of that separation. The quiet here wasn't just comfort. It was distance, distance from conversations he had stopped answering and from a call he never returned, one that still sat in his mind like something left unfinished. Morel didn't move. It wasn't in the walls. That was the part she kept returning to. Not the sound itself, but where it seemed to come from. Elric pushed his chair back slightly, the legs brushing against the wooden floor with a soft drag. For a second, he thought he felt something answer it. Not a sound exactly. More like a shift. A small adjustment beneath him. He didn't mention that. He rarely mentioned things that unsettled him. It was easier to let small details pass, to file them into harmless explanations before they had time to become something that needed attention. "This place is old," he said instead, standing up. "Everything settles differently when it rains." He stepped toward the center of the room, testing his weight unconsciously. The boards held, solid, familiar, but there was a faint hesitation in the way they responded, as if the pressure took a fraction longer to travel through them. Morel watched him, her expression steady, but not convinced. "It stopped when you moved." Elric paused. He hadn't noticed that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It had shape to it, a kind of waiting that didn't belong to either of them. Then it came again, a soft, measured scratching. Not random, not frantic. It followed a pattern, 3 short movements, a pause, then 2 slower ones. It didn't sound like something trying to get out. It sounded like something keeping time. Morel's hand tightened slightly against the doorway. "That's not pipes." Elric nodded before he realized he was doing it. The sound wasn't loud enough to echo, but it carried clearly through the floor, as if the space beneath them had been shaped to guide it upward. He stepped closer to where the noise had come from. The wood there looked no different than the rest. Same grain, same faint wear near the edges. But when he shifted his weight again, the response was different this time. Softer, not weaker, just less final. Like there was something beneath it that moved in return. The scratching stopped, not gradually, not fading. It ended in the middle of the pattern, as if interrupted. The silence that followed felt more deliberate than the sound had. Elric crouched down slowly, placing his hand flat against the floor. The wood was cold, not from the rain, a deeper kind of cold, like it had been separated from the warmth of the room for too long. He kept his palm there, waiting for something, another sound, a vibration, anything that might confirm what he thought he'd felt. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, something shifted beneath his hand. Not scratching this time, breathing. It wasn't loud enough to hear in the usual sense. It was a pressure, a subtle rise and fall that moved through the wood in slow intervals. Too steady to be random, too measured to be part of the house. Elric pulled his hand back without thinking. Morel took a step closer. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. The question felt too large for what he had just felt, too defined. Whatever was beneath them didn't fit into something that could be explained that quickly. "It's nothing," he said, though the word didn't hold. The floor remained still, but not empty. Morel glanced down, then back at him. "You felt something." He exhaled slowly. "It's probably just the way the air moves under the boards." Morel didn't agree, but she didn't argue either, the way people do when they choose to accept an explanation they don't believe. Even as he said it, the explanation seemed to dissolve. The house didn't have a crawl space. He had checked when they moved in. Solid foundation, no gaps wide enough for anything to move through. That had been one of the reasons he chose it. The rain outside shifted slightly, growing softer. The change made the silence inside more noticeable, like something had stepped closer in its absence. Morel moved past him, crossing the room with careful steps. She stopped near the same spot, looking down as if trying to align herself with something she couldn't see. "Do it again," she said. Elric frowned. "Do what?" "Walk." He hesitated, then took a step. The floor answered, not immediately, a fraction later. The same pattern returned, but slower this time. One movement beneath his foot, then a pause, then another. It followed him, not exactly matching his steps, but staying close enough to feel intentional. Morel's breathing shifted slightly. "It's copying you." The word lingered. Copying. Elric stopped moving. The scratching stopped too. They stood there, both looking at the same place, neither willing to step away from it first. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because something had filled the space between them. "Maybe it's an animal," Elric said quietly, though the pattern didn't fit anything he could name. "Something got under the house." Morel shook her head once. "Animals don't wait like that." Another pause. Then, almost carefully, Elric stepped back. The response came again. Not directly beneath his foot this time, but slightly offset, as if whatever was below had adjusted its position. "Tracking him." Morel's voice dropped. "It's under the whole floor." Elric didn't respond. He was listening, not just for the scratching now, but for the gaps between it. The moments where nothing happened, but something still felt present. The house had always been quiet in a way he appreciated. No distant traffic. No neighbors close enough to hear through the walls. That had been part of the appeal. Now the quiet felt occupied. Morel took a step back toward the hallway. "I don't like this." Elric nodded faintly, though he hadn't decided what this was yet. The sound, the pattern, the way it seemed to respond, it all fit together too cleanly to be random. But it also didn't push far enough to be understood. It stayed just outside of that. He looked down at the floor again. For a moment, he had the strange sense that if he waited long enough, something might press back. Not hard, not enough to break through, just enough to acknowledge that it was there. Waiting the same way they were, the rain softened further, and in the space beneath them, something adjusted again quietly, almost politely, as if preparing to continue. Morel didn't return to the kitchen. She stayed near the hallway, arms loosely folded, not tense, but not at ease either. The house had shifted into something quieter than before, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that settled. It held. It listened. Elric remained where he was, though he wasn't sure why. The spot on the floor hadn't changed. It looked the same as it had when they first moved in, clean, intact, ordinary. But now it carried a weight that hadn't been there before, like a detail he had missed and couldn't unsee. "It's following delay," he said, mostly to himself. Morel glanced at him. "What?" "The timing," he continued. "It doesn't move when I move. It moves after. Like it's learning the rhythm first." It didn't feel like something that needed explaining. It felt like something that had already decided how it would behave. If anything, it made the space beneath them feel more deliberate. Morel shifted her stance slightly. "So it's listening." The word settled into him in a familiar way. Someone had said that once before, in a different place, with the same quiet certainty, and he had dismissed it just as easily, choosing not to follow where it might lead. Elric didn't answer. The word settled too easily into place. He stepped again, slower this time. Nothing. For a second, the absence felt like relief. The floor stayed still, unresponsive. For a second, it felt like it had stopped too cleanly, like something had chosen that exact moment to wait, as if whatever had been there had retreated. The room loosened slightly around them, tension thinning just enough to notice. Then, without warning, the response came. Not from beneath his foot. From behind him, a soft, dragging movement that followed the same pattern as before, but displaced. It wasn't mimicking his step now. It was correcting itself. Morel's voice came out quieter than before. It moved. Elric turned slowly. The sound had come from closer to the wall, just a few feet from where he had been standing earlier. The pattern repeated once more, slower, more spaced out, as if whatever was below had adjusted its position and was testing the new alignment. He didn't step toward it this time. Instead, he watched. The floor didn't react immediately. It held still for a few seconds longer than before, long enough to feel like a pause in a conversation. Then, faintly, a different sound joined in. Not scratching, something softer. A brushing motion, like fabric against wood. It carried through the boards unevenly, breaking and reforming in small intervals, as if passing through narrow spaces. Morel leaned slightly forward. "That's not the same." "No," Elric said. It wasn't. The earlier pattern had been precise, measured. This felt layered, like more than one movement overlapping just enough to blur into something harder to isolate. He crouched again, slower this time, lowering himself until his hand hovered just above the floor. He didn't touch it immediately. The hesitation felt necessary, though he couldn't explain why. The brushing sound shifted, not louder, not closer, just aware. Elric placed his palm down. The cold was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't flat anymore. It pulsed slightly, not in a steady rhythm like before, but in uneven intervals that didn't quite repeat. He kept his hand there. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, directly beneath his palm, something aligned. The breathing returned, but it wasn't alone this time. It overlapped with something else, another rhythm, slightly out of sync. The two patterns moved together, adjusting, correcting, almost finding each other. Elric held his breath without realizing it. Morel noticed. "Don't." He looked up at her. "Don't match it," she said quietly. He hadn't meant to, but now that she said it, he could feel how easy it would be. The rhythm was simple, slow enough to follow, close enough to slip into without effort. He pulled his hand back. The patterns below shifted immediately, not stopping, just changing. The breathing became less, even slightly faster, as if compensating for the loss of contact. The brushing sound followed, tightening into shorter movements that clustered near the same spot. Morel took another step back. It noticed. Elric stood up slowly. "It's just reacting to pressure." But the explanation felt thinner now. The house had been built on a solid foundation. No crawl space, no access beneath the floors. He had seen the plans himself when they signed the paperwork. Everything was sealed, reinforced. There wasn't supposed to be space for anything to move like this. The brushing sound spread outward slightly. For a moment, it didn't follow any structure at all, the movement slipping out of pattern before quietly returning to it, then narrowed again, as if tracing the boundaries of something unseen. It didn't travel randomly. It followed lines, structural lines, the hidden grid of beams and supports that held the house together. Elric's gaze drifted toward the vent near the base of the far wall. It had been quiet all night. Now, faintly, something moved through it. Not air. A subtle shift, like something passing just beyond the opening. It didn't produce a clear sound, just a soft displacement that disturbed the stillness around it. Morel noticed it too. "Did you feel that?" He nodded. The vent didn't move again, but the space around it felt different, slightly denser, like the air had been used. Elric took a step toward it. The floor beneath him responded again, but this time the delay was shorter. The pattern tightened, following his movement more closely than before. Not perfectly in sync, but closer than it had been minutes ago. Learning faster. He stopped halfway to the vent. The response stopped with him. The house settled into a new kind of quiet. Not empty, not waiting, just occupied. Morel spoke again, softer now. "You said there was no space under the house." "There isn't," Elric replied, but the certainty wasn't there anymore. He looked down at the floor, then toward the vent, then back again. The connection between them wasn't visible, but it felt present, like different openings into the same hidden layer. The brushing sound returned briefly, then faded, leaving only the breathing behind. Slower now, more controlled, as if whatever was beneath them had adjusted its pace to something more sustainable. Morel moved closer to the wall, keeping distance from the center of the room. What if it's not under the house? Elric frowned. Where else would it be? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the floor, then at the walls, then at the ceiling, as if testing the boundaries of the space they thought they understood. What if this is the top? She said finally. The thought didn't land all at once. It unfolded slowly, settling into the room in pieces. Elric felt it before he fully processed it. The way the sounds traveled, the way the patterns aligned with movement, the way the vent seemed connected without any visible path. Not beneath. Parallel. The breathing below them shifted again. Not louder, closer. And for a brief moment, just before it steadied, it matched the rhythm of Elric's own breath almost exactly. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had adjusted to it or if something beneath him had adjusted first. He didn't realize it until it drifted away again. Morel watched him carefully. You felt that. He nodded once. Neither of them spoke after that. The house didn't return to normal. It held its new shape, and somewhere just out of sight, something continued quietly, patiently adjusting to them in return. Elric didn't sleep. He lay on his back, eyes open, watching the ceiling without really seeing it. The room had gone dark hours ago, but the darkness didn't feel empty. It had a kind of weight to it now, like something had settled into place once the lights were off. Morel was turned away from him, her breathing steady but not deep enough to be sleep. Every so often it shifted slightly, as if she was listening even while lying still. The house had grown quieter, not silent. The rain had stopped at some point, leaving behind a soft dampness in the air that pressed gently against the windows. Without it, the smaller sounds carried further. Subtle movements, faint adjustments in the structure, and beneath it all, that slow, measured breathing. It hadn't stopped. It had only changed. Earlier, it had been uneven, layered, searching. For a brief moment, the rhythm slipped, missing a beat that didn't return, as if something in it had been interrupted and quietly corrected. Now it felt more stable, more intentional, like whatever was below or beside had settled into a rhythm that matched the house itself. Elric became aware of his own breathing again, not by focusing on it, but by noticing how easily it could fall into the same pace. The intervals were close enough that it required no effort to align them, just a small adjustment. He shifted slightly, turning onto his side. The mattress gave under his weight. A second later, the boards gave a delayed answer, the shift beneath him arriving just late enough to feel intentional, not directly under the bed. Offset, as if it had anticipated the movement but misjudged the position. Elric froze. The response corrected itself. A soft, dragging motion repositioned whatever was below, followed by a pause. Then the breathing returned, closer this time, aligned more precisely with where he now lay. Morel spoke without turning. It followed you. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness, it carried clearly. Elric didn't deny it. He placed his hand lightly against the mattress, fingers spread, as if testing the surface for any shift. The fabric felt normal, warm from his body, but beneath that, through the frame and into the floor, something held its place. Not pressing upward, just present. They're mapping us. The idea pressed against something deeper than fear. It felt structured, deliberate in a way he recognized, like a system closing in around him without asking, the same quiet loss of control he had tried to leave behind when he moved here. Morel said quietly. Elric frowned. They? She turned her head slightly, enough to glance back at him. There's more than one. He didn't want to agree. But the patterns earlier, the overlapping rhythms, the slight variations had already suggested it. The breathing beneath them shifted again, not in volume, in number. For a brief moment, the rhythm split. Two separate intervals, slightly out of sync, moving together before settling back into one. Elric sat up slowly. The response came faster this time. The movement below adjusted almost immediately, the delay nearly gone. The scratching didn't return, but something else did a soft, controlled repositioning, like careful steps taken in a confined space. Morel pushed herself up onto her elbows. It's getting closer. Elric swung his legs over the side of the bed, placing his feet on the floor. The contact sent a clear signal. The breathing beneath him aligned again, tighter now, more exact. It didn't feel like imitation anymore. It felt like calibration. He stood. Something beneath it adjusted a moment later, instantly. No delay, no hesitation. A subtle shift traced his movement as he stepped away from the bed, following him with quiet precision. Myrelle watched, her expression unreadable. "Don't move too much." He stopped. The response stopped with him. The stillness that followed was different from before. It didn't feel like a pause, it felt like a tension. Elric looked toward the door, then back at the floor. The layout of the house ran through his mind automatically: room positions, support beams, the way the structure connected. It had always made sense. Clean. Logical. Now it felt incomplete. He took a step toward the hallway. The floor beneath him adjusted again, but not just beneath his feet. The movement spread outward, branching slightly, as if more than one point was tracking him now. Myrelle noticed. "There are more." Elric didn't respond. He reached the doorway and paused. The hallway beyond was darker, the absence of light deeper there. The air felt cooler, though the temperature hadn't changed. From somewhere further down near the living room, a faint sound emerged. Not scratching. A soft, repetitive tap, measured, even, like something marking time against a surface. Myrelle slid off the bed, moving carefully to join him. That wasn't there before. Elric nodded. The sound continued, steady and unhurried. It didn't react to their presence the way the breathing did. It held its own pattern, separate but connected. He stepped into the hallway. The response followed immediately. No delay at all now. The movement beneath him was smooth, controlled, almost fluid. It matched his pace closely, adjusting with each step in real time. Myrelle stayed just behind him, her movements slower, more cautious. The floor beneath her reacted too, but not in the same way. The alignment was less precise, slightly offset, as if whatever was tracking her had a different reference point. They reached the midpoint of the hallway. The tapping sound grew clearer. It was coming from near the vent in the living room. Elric felt a subtle change in the air again as they approached. Not a draft, not movement in the usual sense, just a difference in density, like the space had been occupied recently. The vent was still, but the sound continued from just beyond it. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. A pattern. Myrelle leaned slightly closer. "It's not random." Elric crouched down, keeping a small distance from the vent. The floor beneath him responded instantly, the movement aligning so closely now that it felt less like something beneath him and more like something moving with him. The tapping stopped. Not because he moved, because he stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Myrelle whispered, "It knows when we're listening." Elric reached out slowly, placing his fingers near the edge of the vent. The metal was cool, still. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the other side, something tapped back. Not loud, not forceful, just enough to confirm that there was something there, and that it had been waiting. Elric didn't pull his hand away. He kept his fingers near the vent, not touching it now, just close enough to feel the faint coolness coming from the metal. The air around it had that same dense quality again, like it had been used moments before they arrived. Myrelle stood just behind him, her presence steady but restrained. She wasn't leaning in anymore. She had shifted into stillness, the kind that comes when movement feels like a mistake. "Don't answer it," she said quietly. Elric hadn't planned to, but the thought had already crossed his mind before she spoke. Not as a decision, more like an option that had appeared without being invited. The tapping didn't continue. It didn't repeat its pattern or try to reestablish contact. It simply stopped, as if it had completed something small and didn't need to do more. Elric lowered his hands slowly. The moment he moved, the floor beneath him adjusted again. Not just one point this time, Several. Subtle shifts spread outward, quiet and controlled, repositioning in response to him leaving the vent. Morell noticed the change in his posture. It's not just here anymore. He nodded faintly. The alignment had expanded. What had started as a single point beneath his feet now felt distributed, like multiple positions working together. None of them pressing upward, none of them forcing contact, just staying close enough. Elric stood and turned slightly, looking back down the hallway toward the bedroom. The darkness there felt different now, not deeper, more occupied. "They're keeping distance," he said. Morell frowned. "That doesn't make it better." "No," he agreed. "It makes it organized." The word settled between them. Organized. The breathing beneath the floor shifted again, not in rhythm this time, but in spacing. The intervals stretched slightly, as if whatever was producing it had adjusted to a slower, more sustainable pace, or was waiting. Elric took a step back from the vent. Something beneath him adjusted a moment later, quietly repositioning as if it had been waiting for that exact movement, almost instantly correcting its position. Perfectly. No delay. No correction. The movement beneath him mirrored his position with quiet accuracy, maintaining a consistent offset that never quite overlapped. Morell stayed near the wall, watching both him and the floor. "It learned you." He didn't respond. Ignoring it felt easier, and for a moment, the pattern beneath him seemed to settle into something smoother, as if that choice made things simpler. The idea had already taken shape in his mind, not as something dramatic, just as a simple conclusion that fit the pattern too well to ignore. They moved back into the bedroom together. The transition didn't break anything. The alignment continued, adjusting seamlessly as they crossed the threshold. The space beneath them didn't feel like it belonged to separate rooms anymore. It moved as one continuous layer. Morell stopped near the bed but didn't sit down. "What happens if we stay still?" Elric considered it. Then he did exactly that. He stood in the center of the room and didn't move. The floor beneath him held position. The breathing continued, steady and quiet, maintaining the same distance. The additional movements, the smaller shifts that had begun to appear also settled into place, spacing themselves out in a loose perimeter. Morell watched for a few seconds, then spoke softly. "They're waiting for something." Elric didn't ask what. He felt it instead. The way the patterns held without drifting. The way nothing escalated, nothing pushed further than it needed to. It wasn't trying to break through. It wasn't trying to reach them. It was maintaining alignment. He exhaled slowly. The breathing below adjusted, not matching exactly, but close enough. Morell's voice dropped even lower. "Don't sync with it." He hadn't meant to. But now that she said it, he could feel how easily it could happen. The rhythm was simple, patient, designed to be followed, without effort. He shifted his stance slightly. The alignment shifted with him. No delay, no error, just quiet correction. Morell looked toward the floor, then back at him. "It's not copying anymore." Elric nodded once. "No, it already knows." For a second it felt unclear whether it had learned them, or if they had simply started to move the way it expected. The realization didn't arrive as fear. It settled more quietly than that, like something being understood after it had already been true for a while. Elric moved toward the bed. It corrected itself just after, the movement settling into place without hesitation, maintaining the same distance, the same spacing, the same careful avoidance of direct overlap. He sat down. The mattress dipped. A second later, something beneath adjusted to match the new position, not under the bed, beside it, as if the space directly beneath was already occupied. Morell noticed. Her voice came out thin. "There's something under there." Elric didn't look. He didn't need to. The pattern had already shown him. The alignment wasn't random. It avoided certain areas consistently, maintained distance from specific points as if those spaces were already taken. He lay back slowly. The ceiling above him felt lower now, though it hadn't moved. The darkness pressed closer, not because it changed, but because he was aware of more beneath it. Morel didn't lie down. She remained standing, watching him, then the floor, then the bed. "They're not coming up," she said after a moment. Elric stared at the ceiling. "No," he replied. "They're just adjusting." The word felt accurate. Not invading, not retreating, adjusting. The breathing beneath the floor settled into a steady rhythm again, one that no longer shifted with every small movement. It had found something stable. Morel took a slow step back toward the wall. The floor beneath her responded too, but differently than before. The alignment there was looser, less precise, as if whatever tracked her hadn't fully settled yet. For a brief moment, it became clear to him that the house had never been separate from anything. He hadn't come here to find silence. He had come here to avoid something, and whatever he had left behind had simply adjusted, settling into the space with him. Elric closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to feel the pattern more clearly. The house no longer felt like something he occupied. It felt like something he was positioned within. The floor beneath him remained still, but not empty. The breathing continued. Soft, measured, present, and somewhere within that layered rhythm, just faint enough to be dismissed, there was a second pattern forming. Not beneath, not beside, closer. Morel noticed it first. Her voice came out almost soundless. "Elric." He opened his eyes. The bed hadn't changed. The room hadn't changed. But something in the spacing had. The alignment that had kept its distance until now shifted slightly, closing just enough to remove the gap it had always maintained. Not touching, just no longer avoiding. Elric didn't move. Neither did Morel. The house held its shape. The patterns continued, and whatever had been beneath them from the beginning no longer felt separate from where they were. It felt placed, and for a moment that was easy to dismiss. The spacing beneath him adjusted once more, as if making room for something that hadn't been there before. Story number 3. Soren pressed his palm against the glass, and for a second, it felt like it had already been there before he touched it. The mirror was colder than it should have been, not from the air in the basement, but from something deeper, like the surface wasn't holding temperature the way it was supposed to. His fingers stayed there for a second longer than necessary, spread slightly, as if testing resistance. Behind him, the sound held its place. For a moment, one beat didn't arrive where it should have, slipping just enough to feel misplaced before quietly correcting itself. It had been there all evening, not loud, not mechanical enough to belong to a clock he could point to. It sat somewhere in the room, without taking up space, steady and patient, slipping between the softer rhythm of rain tapping against the narrow basement window. He hadn't come down here for the mirror. That was the part that kept returning to him. The light above the stairs had been left on. A thin strip of it cut across the floor behind him, stopping just short of where he stood. Everything past that line belonged to the basement cooler, quieter, sealed in a way the rest of the house wasn't. He had only meant to check the fuse box. The mirror had already been there, leaning slightly against the far wall, angled just enough that it caught him the moment he stepped fully into the room. It wasn't large, just tall enough to hold his full height if he stood close. The frame was simple, dark wood, worn at the edges in a way that suggested it had been moved more than it had been used. He didn't remember seeing it before. Soren lowered his hand. The reflection did the same, perfectly. For a moment, nothing felt off. The alignment was exact. His shoulders, his posture, even the slight tension in his jaw carried across without distortion. The ticking continued. Soren leaned in slightly, not enough to touch the glass again, but close enough that his breath should have reached it. It didn't. The surface remained clear. He frowned. The rain outside shifted, growing heavier for a few seconds, then settling back into its earlier rhythm. The sound filled the space just enough to make the ticking feel closer. He exhaled again, slower this time. Still nothing. The mirror didn't fog. Soren tilted his head slightly. The reflection followed, but something about the timing felt adjusted, not delayed. Not a head, just cleaner, like the movement on the other side had resolved before his own had fully finished. He straightened. The reflection straightened. The same, and not. Soren took a step back. The basement floor creaked softly under his weight. The sound carried differently down here, shorter, less echo, as if the room absorbed more than it returned. The reflection stepped back with him. Again, exact. The ticking slipped between both movements without changing. He glanced over his shoulder, toward the stairs. The light was still there. The narrow strip hadn't moved. Nothing behind him had changed. When he looked back, the reflection was already facing forward. Zoran froze. He hadn't moved yet. It wasn't a large difference. Not something that would stand out if he hadn't been watching so closely. But the alignment had shifted by just enough to break the sequence. His body turned. Then, the reflection didn't adjust. It was already there. Soren stared at it, trying to trace the moment he had missed. The order had been wrong, but only slightly. Close enough to dismiss. Close enough to explain if he chose to. The pause didn't feel like something he chose. It felt placed there, like part of a sequence he was only just noticing. The reflection didn't move either. The rhythm didn't leave. Steady, measured. Soren raised his hand again, slower this time. His fingers lifted into the space between them, stopping just short of the glass. The reflection mirrored him. Perfect. He held it there. The position stayed aligned. Nothing slipped. Nothing corrected. For a moment, it felt normal again. Soren lowered his hand. The reflection lowered its hand. At the same time, the timing was exact. He exhaled quietly. The mirror remained clear. The ticking didn't change. Soren stepped slightly to the side. The reflection matched him, but not across the center. It adjusted its position in a way that kept itself more centered in the frame than he was. A small correction. Subtle. Intentional. Soren stopped. The reflection stopped. The difference remained. He shifted again, testing it. The movement was followed, but the correction stayed. Like the mirror preferred a version of him that was positioned more precisely than he had been. The rain softened. The ticking became easier to hear. Soren felt the thought form before he could stop it. Not that the reflection was wrong, that it was right. He stepped forward again, closer this time. The glass didn't fog. His breath didn't reach it. It stayed clear, too clear. Soren leaned in just enough that his forehead nearly touched the surface. The reflection leaned in, closer, but the distance felt reduced. Not physically, as if the version of him on the other side occupied the space more completely. The ticking slipped into a slightly tighter rhythm. Soren blinked. The reflection blinked, but the closing of its eyes felt more complete, like it had committed to the movement in a way he hadn't. He pulled back slightly. The reflection pulled back, aligned again. Soren stayed still. The mirror stayed still. It didn't stop, and somewhere between one beat and the next, the sense of control shifted not enough to break anything, just enough to make it unclear which side was deciding the movement. Soren didn't step away. He stayed where he was, close enough to the mirror that the space between them felt thinner than it should have been. The basement hadn't changed, but the way it held him had. The air felt more contained, like the room had quietly adjusted to keep everything in place. It stayed where it was, between everything else. It didn't grow louder. It just settled deeper into the space, threading itself between his movements and the soft, steady rain beyond the window. Neither sound interrupted the other. They moved together without touching. Soren lifted his hand again, slower this time. He watched carefully, not the whole reflection, just the hand fingers, joints, the slight tension at the wrist. He focused on the smallest part of the movement, the place where a delay would be easiest to catch. His fingers rose. The reflection's fingers rose together, but not equally. There was no gap between them, no visible delay. The difference came from something else, something harder to measure. The reflection didn't hesitate. It didn't adjust mid-motion. It reached the final position cleanly, as if the movement had already been decided before it began. Soren held his hand in the air. The reflection held its hand, perfectly aligned, but the stillness didn't feel shared. Soren lowered his hand halfway, then stopped. The reflection lowered its hand and finished. His remained suspended. He stared at it. The hand on the other side had already come to rest. Fingers relaxed, movement complete. His own hand hovered midair, unfinished, as if waiting for instruction. Soren slowly lowered it the rest of the way. It didn't move. It had already done that. The ticking slipped into the space between those two moments, filling it without sound. Soren felt a slight tightening in his chest. Not fear, recognition. He stepped back once. The reflection stepped back. But again, the positioning corrected itself. It settled into the center of the frame, balanced in a way he hadn't been. The difference was small, but it remained after every movement, never fully aligning with him, only approximating him. Soren shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The reflection followed, but smoother, less wasted motion, like it had removed something unnecessary from the action. The rain outside tapped against the window in uneven intervals. The pattern drifted slightly, then returned as if testing itself. Soren glanced at the edges of the mirror, at the frame, at the wall behind it. Nothing else had changed, only the way the reflection behaved within it. He stepped closer again. The glass stayed clear. His breath didn't reach it. The reflection didn't need it to. Soren leaned forward slightly, watching his own face. His eyes, the small, unconscious movements that came with holding a stare too long. The reflection held them more steadily. Less movement, less noise. He blinked. The reflection blinked. But the opening of its eyes felt more precise, as if it had chosen the exact moment rather than followed it. Soren exhaled slowly. The ticking adjusted, not in speed. In placement, it seemed to fall between his breaths now, not overlapping them, not matching them, just occupying the space where his breath ended. He noticed it, and once he noticed it, it didn't shift back. Soren stepped slightly to the left. The reflection followed and corrected, always returning to that centered position, as if the mirror held a version of him that was more complete when it wasn't fully aligned. Soren stopped moving. The reflection stopped. The difference remained. He stayed there for several seconds, letting the stillness settle. The ticking continued. The rain softened again. And in the quiet that followed, Soren felt something else, something small, almost dismissible, a sense that the reflection wasn't waiting for him anymore, that it didn't need to. He raised his hand again, not to test, just to move. The reflection raised its hand, and this time, for a brief moment, the movement on the other side felt like it had begun first. Not earlier in time, just more certain. Soren froze, mid-motion. The reflection completed the movement. His hand remained halfway, unresolved. He slowly finished the motion. The reflection didn't adjust. It had already been there. The ticking settled into a steady, unbroken rhythm. Soren lowered his hand. The reflection stayed still. A small gap formed between what he did and what it held. Not visible, but present. He swallowed, his throat dry in a way that didn't match the cool air of the basement. Behind him, the strip of light from the stairs remained unchanged. Nothing in the house had moved. Nothing in the room had shifted. Only the sequence had changed. Soren leaned in again, closer than before. The distance between his face and the glass narrowed. The reflection leaned in, but the space between them felt reduced again. Not physically, just in the way it resolved, as if the version of him on the other side occupied the position more completely. Soren held his breath. The reflection didn't need to. It didn't stop, and somewhere between one beat and the next, the difference stopped feeling like an error. It started to feel like a correction. Soren didn't leave the basement. He stood there longer than he meant to, though the sense of time had already begun to thin. The ticking hadn't changed, but it no longer felt separate from the room. It sat inside the space with him now, moving through it rather than around it. The mirror held him, not physically, just in the way everything else seemed to settle once he faced it. Soren stepped back again. For a second, it felt like he had already moved before deciding to. The reflection stepped back and corrected. The same small adjustment, the same quiet centering that placed it exactly where it seemed most complete. The difference between them didn't widen. It stabilized. Soren exhaled slowly. The ticking slipped into the end of his breath again, occupying the space just after it finished. He noticed it. He tried not to. It stayed there. Soren turned his head slightly, just enough to break direct alignment. The reflection turned with him, but the movement felt guided, like the version of him on the other side had already reached the position he was still moving toward. He looked away, not fully, just enough to shift his focus toward the edge of the mirror, the frame, the wall behind it. The room remained unchanged, but the sense of orientation didn't. For a moment, it felt unclear which direction he had turned first. Soren looked back. The reflection was already facing him, not waiting, not correcting, just there. Soren stilled. The ticking continued, steady, measured. It didn't rush. It didn't slow. It held. Soren raised his hand again, but this time he didn't watch it. He watched the reflection. His fingers moved. The reflection's fingers moved. And again, the completion of the movement on the other side felt more defined, cleaner, like it had resolved the motion before his own had fully settled. Soren stopped halfway. The reflection didn't. It finished. His hand hovered, incomplete. Soren slowly lowered it. The reflection remained still. It had already done that. The gap widened, not in space, in sequence. Soren felt something shift in his chest again. Not fear, not confusion, something quieter. A recognition that didn't ask for confirmation. He stepped to the side. The reflection followed and corrected, always returning to that centered version, always choosing the more complete position. Soren moved again, faster this time, a small, sharp step. The reflection moved, without hesitation, without correction. It was already there. Soren froze. The timing hadn't slipped. It had aligned differently, not following, not leading, just resolved. It didn't stop, but now it felt closer to his movements, not matching, not sinking, just falling into the spaces where his actions ended. Soren glanced over his shoulder again. The strip of light from the stairs remained, still, unchanged. He took a step toward it. The reflection stepped toward it and remained centered. Soren hesitated. The reflection didn't. It held its position, balanced, complete, as if the step had already been decided. Soren stopped. The reflection didn't adjust. It stayed exactly where it was. A version of him that had already chosen the position he was still considering. The gap widened again. Soren felt it more clearly now, not in the mirror, in himself. A slight delay, a fraction of hesitation in every movement, every shift of weight, every breath that didn't fully resolve before the next began. He became aware of it, and once he noticed it, it didn't disappear. The reflection didn't have it. It moved cleanly, finished, each action complete before the next began. Soren raised his hand again, not to test, just to move. The reflection raised its hand and completed the motion. Soren followed, finishing what it had already done. The ticking settled into the space between those two moments. Soren exhaled. The reflection didn't need to. It held. He stepped back. It held its position without shifting for a fraction longer, then adjusted, not to match him, to correct him. Soren stopped. The reflection was already still. The difference no longer felt like a mistake. For a moment, it wasn't clear whether he had changed to match it, or if it had always been this way and he was only noticing now. Soren stood there, watching it, not himself. It, the version that moved without hesitation, without excess, without the small delays he could now feel in every motion he made. The ticking continued, and for the first time, Soren wasn't sure if it was measuring time or measuring him. Soren didn't step away from the mirror. He moved closer, not to test it, not to confirm anything, just to reduce the distance. The basement remained unchanged, but the sense of space had shifted again. The mirror no longer felt like something placed within the room. It felt like something the room had been arranged around. The ticking continued. Steady, measured. It no longer slipped between his movements. It held them. Soren raised his hand. The reflection raised its hand and completed the motion. Soren followed, finishing what it had already resolved. The difference didn't feel like a gap anymore. It felt like direction. Soren leaned forward slightly. The reflection leaned forward, closer, but the position on the other side felt more stable, more fixed, as if it occupied the space with more certainty than he did. He stopped. The reflection didn't need to. It had already reached the position. Soren adjusted, a small shift of his shoulders. A correction. The reflection remained unchanged. It had already been correct. The movement settled into him slowly, not as a realization, as a quiet acceptance. Soren lifted his hand again, not to test, not to mirror, to match. The reflection moved. He followed, completing the motion in the same way, reducing the hesitation, smoothing the edges of the movement until it felt closer to what he was seeing. The ticking remained steady, but now it felt aligned, not with him, with the version of him in the mirror. Soren breathed in. The reflection didn't. It held. Soren exhaled. The timing adjusted. Not in the mirror. In him. He stepped slightly to the side. The reflection remained centered. He corrected, returning himself to the position the mirror held. The difference closed. Not completely, but enough. Soren stilled. The reflection stilled. The alignment felt closer now. Not exact, but approaching. Soren watched his own face. The small movements, the slight instability in his gaze, the way his eyes shifted without intention. The reflection didn't have that. It held his gaze steadily, unbroken. Soren focused. He reduced the movement, held his eyes in place, matched it. The difference narrowed again. The ticking softened, not in volume, in importance. It no longer marked the space between them. It confirmed it. Soren raised his hand once more. The reflection moved. He followed. This time, the completion of the movement felt almost simultaneous. Not perfect, but close enough that the difference didn't stand out. Soren felt something settle, not in the room, in himself. A reduction, a smoothing. The hesitation he had noticed earlier thinned, then faded, leaving something quieter in its place. Something more precise. He stepped forward. The reflection didn't move. It was already there. Soren aligned himself with it. The position felt correct, not because it matched him, because he matched it. And for a second, the movement didn't feel like his anymore. The mirror remained clear. No breath, no distortion, only the image. Soren lifted his hand slowly and placed it against the glass. The surface was cold, but the resistance felt thinner, not soft, not broken, just less final. The reflection's hand met his, perfectly aligned. For a moment, there was no difference, no delay, no correction, just a single position held on both sides. The ticking continued, steady, measured. Soren held his hand there. The contact remained. The surface didn't give, but something else did. A subtle shift, not in the glass. In the sense of where he ended, he didn't pull his hand away. He didn't need to. It stayed as it was, complete. Soren adjusted again. A small movement. The reflection didn't change. It had already been there. He matched it. The difference closed further. The boundary thinned. Not visibly, but in the way the space between them felt less defined. Soren leaned forward, closer. The reflection didn't move. It didn't need to. He reached the position it already held. The ticking slowed, not in speed. In perception, each beat stretched slightly, as if marking something other than time. Soren's breath settled. His movements reduced. The small hesitations he had felt earlier no longer interrupted the sequence. Everything resolved, cleanly. He remained there, aligned. The mirror didn't change. The room didn't change. Only the reference had. Soren no longer watched himself. He watched the version that had always been correct and adjusted until the difference no longer stood out, until it no longer felt necessary to track which side had moved first. The ticking continued. The rain softened, and somewhere within the stillness, the distinction between movement and reflection thinned just enough that it no longer needed to be resolved. The mirror remained clear, complete, and whatever stood before it no longer felt like something separate from what it held. And for a moment, that didn't last long enough to confirm. It felt as if the version in the mirror had stopped needing him to follow at all. Story number 4. For a moment, I thought I had already moved, but I hadn't. The rain made everything feel slightly delayed. Not slower exactly, just slightly delayed, like everything outside the window had to pass through something thicker before it reached me. The glass was cold when I rested my fingers against it, and for a while I stood there without moving, watching the way the storm pressed itself across the yard. The light behind me stretched forward into the window, turning the dark outside into a faint mirror, not a clean one. The rain broke it into lines that kept shifting, pulling the image apart and putting it back together again. I noticed it because I didn't feel like I was moving, but something in the reflection adjusted anyway. It was small, easy to ignore, the kind of thing you wouldn't even mention out loud because there wasn't anything clear enough to describe. I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to test it, and the version of me on the glass seemed to settle a fraction of a second too late. I waited. Breathing felt slightly out of place, like it didn't match the room. Nothing strange happened after that. The rain kept falling at the same steady pace, tapping against the window in a way that almost erased everything else. The house felt sealed, quiet in that insulated way it always did during storms, like the outside world had been pushed just far enough away to stop mattering. Still, I didn't step back. There was something about the way the reflection held itself. Not wrong, just not fully connected to me. I lifted my hand, slow enough that I could feel the movement in my shoulder before it reached my fingers. For a moment, nothing changed in the glass. Then, just as I stopped, the shape there adjusted into place. I let my arm drop again. It matched that time. Or maybe I had adjusted without noticing. Or maybe I had stopped paying close enough attention to see the difference. The thought stayed with me longer than it should have. Not as fear. More like a quiet question that didn't need an answer yet. I told myself it was the angle of the light, or the way the rain bent everything just enough to throw off timing. That worked for a bit, long enough to feel convincing, not long enough to feel true. I moved away from the window, not because I felt uncomfortable, but because the room behind me had started to feel more noticeable. The floor creaked under my weight in the same places it always did, and the sound of the storm softened the edges of it, blending everything into a low, steady background. From the corner of my eye, the window still held a faint outline of me. I didn't turn to look at it directly. Instead, I walked toward the kitchen, letting my attention shift to smaller things, the uneven rhythm of my steps, the way the light dimmed slightly as I moved further from the lamp, the familiar shape of the counter coming into view. There was nothing unusual about any of it, but the sense of being slightly out of step didn't go away. I poured a glass of water and stood there for a moment, listening. The rain had that constant, layered sound, soft against the roof, sharper against the glass, distant where it hit the ground outside. It filled the space in a way that made everything else feel quieter than it actually was. I took a sip and realized I was still thinking about the window, not about seeing something outside, just about the timing. When I went back, I didn't stand as close this time. I stopped a few steps away, letting the reflection form at a different angle. The silhouette was softer now, less defined, but still clear enough to track movement if I focused on it. I shifted my head slightly. The reflection followed, or maybe it led. I wasn't sure which I had expected. I tried again, slower. This time, I moved before I let myself think about it. The shape on the glass adjusted almost immediately, but there was a moment, small, barely there, where it felt like it had already settled before I finished the movement. That didn't make sense. I stayed where I was after that, letting the seconds pass without testing anything. The longer I looked, the harder it became to separate what I was seeing from what I thought I had seen. The rain helped. It broke the image just enough that nothing stayed consistent for long. Lines shifted, light bent, edges softened and reformed. It gave me something to blame. I told myself that was enough. Behind me, the house made a quiet sound. Just a small shift in the structure, the kind that happens when temperature changes or the wind presses in the right way. It didn't pull my attention fully away, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't just standing in front of a surface. I turned slightly, listening for a moment. Nothing followed. When I looked back at the window, the reflection had already settled into place. Too clean, like something had been corrected before I saw it. For a second, it felt like I had missed something, not a movement, not a change. Just a moment that should have been there and wasn't. I stepped closer again, almost without deciding to. My hand lifted, slower this time, careful. The silhouette didn't move. Not immediately. It held in place, as if waiting. Then, just before I stopped, it adjusted, matching the position I was about to reach, not the one I was in. I froze with my fingers just short of the glass. The cold from earlier hadn't faded. I could still feel it in my skin, even without touching it again. For a moment, I didn't move at all. Not because I was afraid, because I wasn't sure which version of the movement belonged to me, or which one had started first. I didn't touch the glass. For a while, I just stood there with my hands suspended, noticing how long it took before the urge to move again became uncomfortable. Not physically. It was more like a quiet pressure, the kind that builds when something expects completion. When I finally lowered my arm, I did it slowly enough to feel each part of the motion. The silhouette followed, or maybe it had already adjusted before I finished. I stepped back again, creating space between myself and the window, and that helped more than I expected. Distance made the reflection less precise. It blurred the edges, softened the timing, gave everything just enough uncertainty to feel explainable again. I turned away before I could test it further. The kitchen light felt warmer than it had earlier. Not brighter, just more contained. I leaned against the counter, listening to the rain settle into a steady rhythm that almost erased the smaller sounds in the house. For a moment, I let myself believe that was all it had been. Light, angle, weather, something easy. Still raining? The voice came from the doorway behind me, calm and familiar. I glanced over my shoulder. Tamsin stood there, one hand resting lightly against the frame, her posture relaxed in that way people have when they've been listening for a while before speaking. "Yeah," I said. "Hasn't really let up." She nodded once, stepping into the room. "Sounds heavier now." "It does." She moved past me without hesitation, reaching for the kettle like she had done 100 times before. The small, ordinary movement grounded the space in a way nothing else had. The quiet click of metal against the counter, the faint rush of water filling it, everything lined up the way it should. I watched her for a moment, then looked back toward the window. From here, I could only see part of it. A dim slice of reflected light, broken by the rain. Nothing stood out. "You okay?" she asked, not turning around. "Yeah," I said, a little too quickly. "Just thought I saw something off in the glass earlier." She paused for half a second, then continued what she was doing. "Storm does that. Makes everything feel a bit out of place." "That's what I figured. You get weird reflections, especially with the inside lights on," she added. "It's just layering, inside over outside." Her tone stayed even, not dismissive, just practical. The kind of explanation that didn't need to prove anything. I nodded, even though she wasn't looking. "Probably that," I said. The kettle clicked softly as it settled onto the base. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the rain filled the space between us again, steady and consistent, like it had been the whole time. Tamsin leaned back against the counter, folding her arms loosely. You were standing there for a while. I know. What were you looking at? I hesitated. Timing, I said finally. She tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to decide if I was joking. Timing? Just the way the reflection was moving, it felt a little off. Off how? I searched for the right way to explain it and couldn't find anything that didn't sound more definite than it actually was. Like it wasn't matching exactly, I said. Not wrong, just not lined up. She let that sit for a second. Rain distorts it, she said. You're not seeing one clean surface. It's all broken up. Of course it's going to lag or shift. Yeah, I said again. It almost made sense, enough to stop questioning it. She pushed off the counter and crossed the room, stopping just short of the window. You mean like this? She lifted her hand slightly, not all the way, just enough to create a faint shape in the reflection. I watched the glass carefully. The silhouette formed. It matched her, cleanly. No delay at all. No hesitation. She moved again, quicker this time. The reflection followed without any visible gap. Looks normal to me, she said, glancing back at me. Yeah, I said, and it did. It felt completely normal. That was the problem. It shouldn't have been that perfect. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and positioned myself beside her. From this angle, our reflections overlapped slightly, merging where the light was strongest. Try again, I said. She gave me a small look, then lifted her hand once more. Again, it matched perfectly. No shift, no correction. Nothing I had seen earlier. See, she said, lowering her arm. It's just the rain. Maybe. She studied my expression for a moment longer, then nodded toward the rest of the house. You've been in here too long. Storms make everything feel strange if you stare at them. I wasn't staring that long. She smiled faintly. You always say that. The kettle clicked softly behind us, signaling it was ready. She turned away from the window without another glance, moving back toward the counter. I stayed where I was. The reflection adjusted as I shifted my weight. Perfectly. I waited until she was facing away, her attention on the mugs, before I tried again. Slow, careful. I lifted my hand just enough to track it against the glass. For a moment, everything aligned. Then, just before I reached the highest point of the movement, the silhouette settled early. Not by much, but enough. I stopped immediately. The version in the glass was already still. My arm was not. I lowered it slowly, finishing the motion it had already completed. Behind me, I could hear Tamsin moving, the soft clink of ceramic, the quiet pour of water. Normal sounds. Grounding. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew where everything was. Instead, I stepped slightly to the side, changing my position relative to the light. The silhouette shifted with me, but the alignment felt closer now. Not fixed, just easier, as if the difference between us had narrowed without me noticing when. I moved again, slower than before. This time, I didn't wait to see what it would do. I watched my own movement instead, focused on the sensation of it, the balance, the timing. When I finally looked back at the glass, the silhouette was already where I expected it to be, or maybe where it expected me to be. I made tea, Tamsin said from behind me. Her voice felt slightly farther away than it should have. Thanks, I said. I stepped back from the window, not because I was done, just to see if the distance would change anything. It didn't. The reflection held steady, like it didn't need to adjust anymore. Too steady. For a brief moment, I had the sense that if I stepped forward again, I wouldn't be testing it anymore. I would be adjusting to it. Or maybe I already had been. I picked up the mug when she handed it to me, the warmth grounding in a way the room hadn't been before. Better? She asked. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. Mostly. I took a sip, letting the heat settle, and forced myself to look away from the window completely. The conversation drifted after that. Small things, unimportant details, the kind of quiet exchange that fills space without asking for attention. But even as I listened, Part of me stayed aware of where the window was. Not looking, just knowing. And somewhere in that awareness, a quieter thought settled in. Not urgent, not sharp, just present. The next time I checked, I wouldn't be trying to see if it was wrong. I'd be trying to see how close it had gotten. The tea helped more than I expected. Not because it changed anything about what I had seen, but because it gave my hands something steady to hold. The warmth stayed consistent, predictable in a way the rest of the room hadn't been for a while. Tamsin settled into the chair near the far wall, her presence quiet but noticeable. She didn't say much at first, just sat there with her mug, listening to the rain the same way I had earlier. The silence between us wasn't empty. It felt shared, like neither of us needed to fill it. I stayed near the counter, angled slightly away from the window, not avoiding it, just not engaging. For a while, that was enough. "You're still thinking about it," she said eventually. It wasn't a question. "Not really," I replied. She let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. "You always say that when you are." I didn't respond. The rain shifted slightly, becoming heavier against the glass for a few seconds before settling again. The sound blurred the edges of the room, making distances feel less exact. I took another sip of tea. "Do it again," I said after a moment. "Do what?" "Stand by the window." She looked at me for a second, then shrugged lightly and stood. "All right." She moved back to the same spot as before, stopping just short of the glass. From where I stood, I could see both her and the reflection clearly, the angle slightly different now because of the way the light had shifted in the room. "Now what?" she asked. "Just move your hand." She raised it casually. The reflection followed. It was clean. No delay, no early settling. Nothing. "Still looks normal," she said. "Yeah." I watched carefully, waiting for something to slip. It didn't. "Okay," she said, lowering her arm. "Your turn." I hesitated. "Just try it," she added. I set the mug down and stepped forward, positioning myself beside her again. This time, I paid more attention to where my feet were, how my weight distributed across the floor, the exact angle of my shoulders relative to the glass. Everything felt a little too controlled. I lifted my hand. The silhouette matched. Clean. Immediate. I kept moving, slower than before. It matched again. Then too easily. No difference. I glanced at Tamsin. She was watching me now, not the window. "See?" she said softly. "Yeah," but I didn't lower my hand right away. I held it there, steady, letting the seconds stretch just a little longer than they needed to. The reflection held too. No drift, no correction, nothing that didn't belong. I lowered my arm. It followed exactly. I stepped back. Still, it held where it should. For a moment, the earlier feeling seemed distant, something I might have imagined or misread. "Better?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, and this time, it felt more convincing. She moved away from the window again, returning to her chair. The room settled back into its earlier rhythm, the rain steady, the light consistent, everything where it should be. I picked up my mug again, warm, real, grounding. I took another sip and let my attention drift away from the glass. That should have been the end of it. The explanation had held. The behavior had normalized. There was nothing left to test. But something small stayed with me. Not the mismatch, the absence of it. It had corrected too completely. Not fixed, just aligned to something I hadn't agreed to. As if whatever I had noticed before had adjusted itself to remove the difference. I didn't look at the window again right away. Instead, I focused on smaller things. The way the steam from the mug rose and thinned into the air. The faint vibration of the kettle cooling on the counter. The soft shift of Tamsin's posture as she settled deeper into the chair. Everything looked fine, or close enough. That helped, until it didn't. "Rowan," she said after a while. "Yeah? You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Listening past things." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You're not really here," she said. "You're checking something." "I'm just thinking." "About the window." I didn't answer. She watched me for a moment longer, then looked toward the glass. "It's fine," she said. "There's nothing there. I know." But as she said it, I noticed something else. Not in the reflection, in the space itself. The distance between where I stood and where she sat felt slightly inconsistent. Not visibly, just in the way sound traveled. Her voice didn't quite match the space between us. It wasn't delayed. It was placed, like it belonged to a slightly different position than where she actually was. I shifted my weight. The floor creaked softly. That matched. I took a step. The sound of it aligned. It felt normal. I took another. Still normal. But when I stopped, the room didn't settle immediately. I noticed it in my grip before I noticed it in the space. It took a fraction longer than it should have for everything to feel still again. Not moving felt easier. Or maybe I did, just slightly differently than I meant to. Neither did she. The rain continued. The rain stayed steady, thick enough to cover everything else. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "The way it held." She looked at me, confused. "It's just the house." "Maybe." I turned slightly, letting my view include the window again without focusing on it directly. The reflection was there. It held where it should. Nothing stood out. But something about the space around it felt structured differently, as if the room wasn't fully matching itself. I walked slowly toward the hallway, not because I needed to go there, but because I wanted to see how the space behaved when I changed position. Every step felt steady. The sound followed exactly, until I reached the midpoint between the kitchen and the doorway. There, something shifted. Not visibly, not in a way I could point to. But the sense of where things were where I was felt slightly recalibrated. I stopped, turned halfway back. The window sat at the same distance it should have. The reflection held. Everything looked correct. But the feeling didn't line up. "Rowan?" Tamsin said. Her voice came from behind me. Close, but not exactly where I expected. "I'm fine," I said. I took another step. The feeling eased. Another. It felt normal. I reached the doorway and rested my hand lightly against the frame. Solid, stable, real. I stayed there for a moment, letting everything settle again. Behind me, the window remained in place, unchanged. But the thought that followed didn't come from what I was seeing. It came from what had just happened. The space hadn't stretched. It hadn't warped. It had adjusted quietly, just enough to make alignment easier. I looked back once more. The silhouette stood exactly where it should, matching perfectly. No delay at all, no difference. For a brief moment, I considered going back, testing it again, pushing it further. But something about the way everything had settled stopped me. Not fear, just a quiet understanding. If I kept testing it, I might not be the one setting the terms anymore. I stayed in the doorway longer than I needed to, not because I was deciding anything, but because the space there felt balanced in a way the rest of the room didn't. The frame held its shape. The distance between my hand and the wall remained consistent. Nothing shifted when I focused on it. Behind me, the kitchen remained quiet. Tamsin hadn't moved. "You're just going to stand there?" she asked. "Just for a second." Her tone stayed light. "You've been saying that a lot." "I know." I didn't turn around yet. Instead, I paid attention to the way the air felt as I stepped back into the room. Not temperature, not movement, just the sense of occupying a position that either fit or didn't. One step, it felt normal. Second step, still normal. Third, something softened. Not under my feet, around me, like the edges of the room weren't as fixed as they had been a moment ago. I stopped. "Rowan," she said, quieter this time. "I'm okay. Come sit down." "Yeah, in a minute." I turned slowly. The window was exactly where it should be. The reflection, perfect. No difference. No delay at all. No early settling. Nothing left to question. That should have settled it. But instead, something else became clearer. The alignment wasn't something I was checking anymore. It was something I was maintaining. I took another step toward the center of the room. This time, I didn't watch the glass. I watched myself. The way my weight shifted, the timing of my breath, the small adjustments in posture that happened without thinking. Everything felt guided, not controlled, just slightly assisted, like there was a version of the movement already decided, and I was following it closely enough that the difference no longer showed. "Rowan," Tamsin said again, standing now. Her chair made a soft sound against the floor. "I think you should sit down." "I'm fine," I said. And I was. That was the part that didn't fit. Nothing felt wrong anymore. The earlier mismatch, the delay, the uncertainty, all gone, replaced with something quieter, more stable. I moved my hand. It matched. I shifted my weight. It matched again. I turned my head slightly, then too easily. No lag, no correction, just alignment. I exhaled slowly. "See?" I said, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. It felt normal. Tamsin didn't answer right away. I glanced toward her. She was watching me carefully now, her expression harder to read. "Rowan," she said, "you're not looking at it." "I don't need to. That's not what you were doing before." "I know." "Then why?" "I figured it out," I said, cutting her off gently. "Figured what out?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, because the answer didn't feel like something I had discovered. It felt like something I had adjusted into. "It's not delayed," I said slowly. "It just settles differently." "That doesn't make sense." "It does if you stop trying to match it exactly." She frowned slightly. "That's the whole point of a reflection." "Maybe." I looked back toward the window, still aligned. It was clean, but the difference was subtle now. Not in what I saw, in how I understood it. "It's easier if you don't lead," I said. "It doesn't like when you lead." "What?" "If you don't try to move first." Tamsin took a small step closer. "Rowan, that's not..." "Just watch," I said. I didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, I let my body settle, not forcing stillness, just allowing it. Then I moved. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough. The reflection matched perfectly. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The movement felt anticipated, not predicted, already placed, like stepping into something that had been set a moment earlier. I stopped. The reflection was already still. I wasn't sure when I had caught up to it. "That's what you're seeing?" Tamsin asked quietly. "Not seeing," I said. "Feeling." She shook her head slightly. "Rowan, that's just your brain trying to..." "It's fine," I said, and I meant it. Completely. The room felt stable now, more than before. The earlier inconsistency had smoothed out into something consistent enough to trust. I stepped closer to the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. My hand lifted. It aligned. My posture adjusted. Then again, without effort. The glass was still cold when my fingers finally touched it. That hadn't changed. But the sensation felt delayed. Not in time. In ownership, like the contact had already happened somewhere else, and I was just arriving at it. I kept my hand there. Behind me, Tamsin moved. I could hear her, but the position of the sound didn't quite anchor the way it used to. "Rowan," she said more firmly now. I didn't turn. "It's okay," I said softly. "You're not acting like yourself." I almost smiled. "That's the point," I said. The words felt natural, not dramatic, just accurate. I shifted slightly, adjusting my stance. The reflection held. Perfect. Unquestioned. For a moment, I tried to remember what it had felt like earlier, when the timing had been off, when the movements hadn't aligned, when there had been something to test. It was harder than I expected. Not gone, just less relevant. The difference had narrowed until it no longer needed attention. Behind me, Tamsin stopped moving. The room settled again. Rain steady. Light consistent. Everything in place. I closed my eyes for a second. Not to rest, just to confirm something. When I opened them again, I didn't check the reflection immediately. I moved first, then looked. It was already where I expected it to be, or where it expected me to be. I couldn't tell which. I lowered my hand from the glass. The cold lingered slightly longer than it should have. I stepped back, or something in the room adjusted before I did. The room adjusted around me, quietly, naturally. Nothing forced, nothing wrong. Just, it held where it should. I think I'm going to stay here for a bit, I said. Tamsin didn't respond. I didn't turn to see why. The window held the same faint mirror of the room, broken gently by the rain. My silhouette remained there. It stayed there, exactly where it should be, like it had always been. Outside, the storm continued without change. Inside, the space no longer felt uncertain. It felt settled, complete in a way that didn't need to be questioned. I stood there, letting the rhythm of the rain carry everything into a softer quiet, not watching, not testing, just existing in the alignment that had already formed. And somewhere in that stillness, the thought returned once more. Not urgent, not sharp, just present. I couldn't remember exactly when the difference had disappeared, only that it had, and that whatever remained now fit well enough that I didn't feel the need to check again. Or maybe I just stopped noticing when it stopped matching. I'm not sure when I stopped checking first.